Well, good morning, everyone. Usually when we get together here at West Beach, we usually greet each other with a hug or maybe a handshake or a kiss on the cheek. But today, as we all know, we find all of us in very different circumstances, right? We find ourselves in times of maybe the unknown. I think usually in times like this, in times of maybe even doubt and fear, there is generally one thing that I would suggest that I think that arises in the human mind whenever we find ourselves in places and spaces and circumstances like this. And I think that one thing that rises to the human mind is questions. Lots and lots of questions. And I think one of the biggest questions that has been around since the beginning of humanity is asked. That big question is asked in a book called Habakkuk. Now, this book, Habakkuk, is one of the minor prophets, which you actually find in the Old Testament. And Habakkuk's question that he asked God, I would suggest is still being asked, that exact same question is still being asked by many people today. I think people have, and they still are grappling with the question of, if there is a God, then why is there so much evil in the world? That is a massive question. And as we said, it's a question that has echoed throughout history. Elie Wiesel, who was a Nobel Peace Prize winner and also a Holocaust survivor, said this. He said, "I rarely speak about God. To God, yes, I protest against him and I shout at him." Elie Wiesel didn't struggle with the question around of existence of God, but his struggle was with why God doesn't always act in a way which makes sense to us. Habakkuk, which is the name of not only the book of the Old Testament, but also the name of the main character in the book of Habakkuk, he experienced, I would suggest, a similar struggle to that of Elie Wiesel. You see, Habakkuk, he clearly believed in God. As we see that he spoke to him, he spoke about him, he wrote about him, and as we're going to see in a minute, he actually flat out accused him and cried out to him. So there was no doubt in his mind about the existence of God. And Habakkuk struggled with this question of why God permits evil to exist in the world. It's captured really quickly in his book. It's actually captured in his very first words to God, which are found in verse 2 of chapter 1. And this is what Habakkuk says to God. He says, "How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing?" Now, Habakkuk doesn't pull any punches here, does he? His language is pretty much straight up accusatory towards God. And I think if we are honest with ourselves, and I think these times are good to be honest with ourselves, many of us would have found ourselves thinking and even saying similar things. I'm sure that many of us can identify, or could identify, with Habakkuk's pain and frustration as he sat there and cried out to God, "Where are you in these times?" There's lots of things I love about the book of Habakkuk, but the part that I actually love the most is that after Habakkuk's actual accusation of God and his cry out of lament to God, the coolest bit is that God actually responds. And I mean, he responds audibly, out loud. Now, the book of Habakkuk, it's only a small book. It's only made up of 3 chapters. And it's in the first 2 chapters where this conversation, or you could even call it a face-off between Habakkuk and God, takes place. So Habakkuk speaks first, and then God responds. Habakkuk speaks again, and then we see God's response one more time. We see that happen. So what I want us to do is I want us to take a look and a listen to this conversation between Habakkuk and God. So it begins with Habakkuk, and he actually comes up and he says that he starts to complain about Israel, his very own people, remember. And he says that they have changed. He says they're changing. And what I'm beginning to see in them is that they have become are very violent. They have become an unjust and they have become corrupt people. And the fact that this has happened to his very own people, that he sees it around him every day, is causing Habakkuk so much pain that he actually starts to cry out to God, and he starts to ask God to directly intervene in what is happening amongst his own people. So then it's God's turn to speak. It's God's turn to reply. And he actually tells Habakkuk, he says, don't worry, I'm not unaware of what is happening. And he says, and don't worry, I'm going to intervene. But the tool that God says to Habakkuk that he's going to use to intervene, and the tool that he says he's going to use to judge Israel, is not what anyone was expecting. Because he actually says to Habakkuk, I will intervene, and I'm going to use the Babylonians to do this. I'm going to use the Babylonians to punish Israel. Now you might be thinking, okay, what does that mean, the Babylonians? You might not know who the Babylonians were, but Habakkuk knew exactly who they were. And we're going to see in his response to this use, in his response to God, that he knew very well who they were and that he could not believe what he was hearing from God. And in verse 13 of chapter 1, we actually see him to cry out. He responds again to God, and this is what he says. He's talking to God, remember. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Then why do you tolerate the treacherous? Talking about the Babylonians. Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? Habakkuk was absolutely hating the fact that God was going to use this incredibly violent and corrupt nation like Babylon to actually judge his very own Israel. And the Babylonians, if you don't know much about them, they were an absolute powerhouse. They had already defeated both the Assyrians, who were one of the most aggressive and oppressive nations back in biblical times, and also the Egyptians. They conquered the Egyptians as well. And now, as God had just told Habakkuk, they were actually on their way and they were going to take out Israel. And Habakkuk was thinking, and God is allowing all of this. So after hearing this, Habakkuk is shocked. He's absolutely appalled. And again, he demands a response from God. In verse 17, it actually talks about him, where he actually describes himself more so of being a watchman, of being a tower guard and standing out on the city walls on behalf of his people. And he cries out to God and he demands a response. And then, as I said, this is when God responds one last time. And the entire second chapter, chapter 2, is taken up with his response. And God actually responds, and he actually gives a revelation and a promise to Habakkuk. And he promises, and the revelation is that although God is still going to use the Babylonians, in this case to judge Israel, he's still going to go ahead and use them. He says, I want you to know that I am also going to eventually tear them down because of their corrupt and evil ways. See, God's response to Habakkuk, and to any other individual for that matter, who cries out that same question of why is there so much evil among us? God's response there is that even though we may not see it in our time, God is going to do what is right and good. God does what is right and good. Sooner or later, God will hold all evil nations and individuals to account. God does hear the cries of the oppressed, and he does hear the cries of the brokenhearted, and he does respond. But sometimes, and often, he doesn't respond in the time frame that we would desire. I think for us it's really hard in a culture of I want it now, whether it be a movie on Netflix, whether it be Wi-Fi at a restaurant or a hotel, or whether it be our favorite food with this Uber Eats. I want it now. In this culture, where we are not accustomed to waiting, we're not accustomed to trusting, and we're not accustomed to practicing patience. This whole petition from God to say to wait, for us to practice waiting, for us to practice faith, for us to practice trust, it can be so challenging for us. But I think if we look at Habakkuk again, after his intense conversation with God in chapters 1 and 2, I think we see Habakkuk's final response in chapter 3. And if we go and we take a look at this, it actually shows us an individual that has decided to trust, despite their incredibly difficult and current context and circumstances, they decide to trust. We're talking about Habakkuk deciding to trust here. The final chapter of Habakkuk is Habakkuk's response, which is seen as a prayer by many people from him to God. And I think it's in the last verses, which is verses 16 to 19, where we actually see the cries of Habakkuk. They move from a lament into a song of trust. This is what he says. When I heard this message, the message being that the Babylonians were coming to judge, when I heard this message, I felt weak from fear. My lips quivered, my bones seemed to melt, and I stumbled around. But I will patiently wait. Someday those vicious enemies will be struck by disaster. Fig trees may no longer bloom, or vineyards produce grapes. He's talking about famine here. Olive trees may be fruitless, and harvest time a failure. Sheep pens may be empty, and cattle stores vacant. But I will still celebrate because the Lord God saves me. The Lord gives me strength. He makes my feet as sure as those of a deer, and he helps me stand on the mountains. For me, I find Habakkuk a really moving story. And what I've done is there are a few reflective thoughts and questions found just underneath the link that you would have clicked on to actually hear this message. So what I want us to do, I want us to invite us all to actually go back and look at some of those questions, grab whoever you may have listened to this message with, or maybe give someone a call if you're by yourself, and actually look at those questions and just have a chat about it, just talk about it. You don't have to use those questions, they're just a framework for all of us to sort of bounce off as we try to discern and listen well to what God has said to us this morning. I would also love to hear your thoughts about what we've spoken about this morning, and I think you can leave any of your whatever comments you have just below, or if you prefer, if it's easier for you or if it's something you would rather do, you can actually just send me an email, or if you know me personally and you've got my phone number, just give me a call and we can chat about it. Thanks so much. If you're from our church family, if you spend time with us here at West Beach, if you've tuned in for this morning, and also if you found your way here and you're not from the church family, we're really glad you're with us. And during these times, I think our message to everyone is that we want to be in this together. We want to be with you and we're for you. And just get in touch with us if we can help you guys in any way. Church family, I miss you. I look forward to hearing from you. Take care of yourselves and vayan con Dios. Ciao.